Hello. Today I will be summarizing and providing my own analysis on Chapter 17 of Indian Politics and Political Processes. This chapter is about Indian secularism and its unique model that India has adopted that is unlike the Western model, but poses its own concerns and questions about the future of this model. Although secularism originated in the West, India adopted a distinct and context-specific form suited to its deeply pluralistic society. And unlike Western secularism, which typically emphasizes a strict separation between church and state, Indian secularism is based on the principles of equal respect for all religions. It allows for state engagement with religion, not to promote any one faith, but to preserve interreligious harmony and ensure that no group is marginalized. So, Indian secularism shares a humanist aim with Western secularism, and it aims to promote self reliance and discourage dependence on supernatural authority in public life. However, it goes further by positively engaging with religion when necessary to maintain social balance and communal unity. The Indian state rejects the historical societal model in which religion, particularly Hinduism, was tied to duty and morality, instead emphasizing a neutral relationship between the state and religion to foster a multicultural democratic society. So the constitutional foundations of this were also a reflection of the complexity of secularism. During the drafting of the Indian Constitution, the Constituent Assembly debated whether to explicitly include the term secular. Three viewpoints emerged. The inclusionists essentially were claiming to say that the term was needed to be included in the Constitution to affirm democratic equality and neutrality. The religious minorities were in the opposite of this, and many of them feared the Hindu dominance and sought recognition of religion in public life to protect their identities. Whereas the moderates, those who were in the middle of these two ideas, were advocating for the principles of secularism without the explicit term, arguing that constitutional guarantees would suffice. Ultimately, the moderate position prevailed, and the word secular was not initially included in the Constitution, but the principles of secular government were embedded in the fundamental rights. And in 1976, the 42nd Amendment officially adopted the word secular to the preamble. Articles 25 to 30 safeguard the religious freedoms and minority rights, such as the freedom of practice, exemption from religious taxes, and the right to run religious educational institutions. However, loopholes remain, such as the vague definition of minority, which can be manipulated to limit protections. And India's secular framework was shaped in the shadow of partition, a moment that threatened to divide the country permanently along religious lines. Leaders like Gandhi, Nehru, and Ambedkar committed to a secular state as a safeguard against communalism. Gandhi believed that politics should be guided by moral values rooted in religion and saw religion as inseparable from public life. Nehru, in contrast, argued for a strict separation of religion and politics, asserting that true political independence required freedom from religious influence. A third vision was also offered by Dien Dayal Upadhyaya, who rejected Western secularism as inappropriate for India. He and later Vajpayee advocated for Dharmajaya, an ethical non-theoretic framework where the state respects all religions without enforcing strict separation. This, they argued, was more culturally fitting than Western models. For the first two decades after independence, the Congress Party was positioning itself successfully as a secular force. Its policies attracted both Hindus and Muslims as it promised non-interference in Muslim personal laws. However, this strategy was criticized by Hindu nationalists, particularly the Bharatiya Jana Sangh, which was seeing it as an appeasement towards Muslims. Under Indira Gandhi, Congress initially maintained its secular character. However, after the 1975 emergency, she lost significant Muslim support to authoritarian excesses. In response, she reoriented her political base toward Hindu voters, particularly in North India. This subtle shift in Congress's approach, which began under Nehru, became more pronounced and culminated in a passive stance during the 1992 demolition of Babri Masjid under Prime Minister Narasimha Rao. Some Muslim elites seeking to protect their community's interests also advocated for communal policies and even reservations, occasionally alienating other Indians. This led to perceptions that Muslim identity was in conflict with Indian national identity. Hindu nationalists capitalized on this, portraying Muslims as separatists and pushing the idea that only Hindus could be truly secular. By the mid 1980s, the BJP, which succeeded the BJS, adopted a militant Hindutva approach. It argued that India's culture was inherently Hindu, and therefore Hinduism deserved primacy in national identity and politics. Several intellectuals even criticized this Indian secular model. Ashish Nandi argued that secularism was alien to India because it lacked the ethical and philosophical foundations that allowed secularism to flourish in the West. He claimed that Western rational secular ideology prioritized tolerance and nonviolence, while Indian public life, still deeply religious, too often turned to communalism and violence. Nandi suggested that Gandhi's model, melding politics with moral religious values, was more appropriate. Partha Chatterjee echoed this view, asserting that religious tolerance was not secularism and was the key to resisting Hindu nationalism, and that this religious tolerance was necessary. In contrast, Rajiv Bhargava defended Indian secularism by promoting the ideas of contextual secularism. Unlike Western secularisms, which arose in homogeneous Christian societies, Indian secularism was perceived as having to take into account the pluralistic and diverse populations. It adopts a principled distance, meaning that the state may selectively engage with religion to maintain social justice and equality. And lastly, Abhay Dubey analyzed how Hindutva gained a mass appeal by promoting a sense of cultural nationalism, blending religion with political identity in ways that challenge India's secular foundation. So, from reading this chapter, I see that there is this complex relationship for Muslims in India being stuck between this idea of what it means to be Indian and part of the national identity and being Muslim and Indian Muslim. It's a complex relationship that we should take into account when talking about Muslim identity in India. Partition was a bloody effort that was aimed at trying to divide South Asia into two separate states with a strong identification on religious grounds. This is going to cause some resentment, some sense of confusion, and just initial complexity as to what it means to be India, knowing that the state of Pakistan and later East Pakistan, which became Bangladesh, literally broke off from India for the sake of preserving religious identity. This isn't to say that India oppresses Muslims, the people who broke and make into the states of Pakistan and later Bangladesh, but it shows this sense of there was another side of this story that we did not choose to be a part of necessarily, whether they are the kids or they were just not born when partition occurred. Understandably, this is a difficult sentiment that many Muslims must feel for India, as it includes that this given history of being India, being a state of India that was based off of the traditional India, did have a Hindu-centric society. This doesn't mean that this Hindu-centric society has been eliminated to this day, or we should say by 1947, because this Hindu society is still a Hindu large group, and even today of India, where most people are more Hindu. There is this sense of, is this truly what it means to be Indian, to mean that you don't have to worry about religion, if there's still such a large group of Hindus that identify as Indians and still have the majority power in some ways? The same Indian values and structures as traditional Hindu India also have a sense of an alarm for many Muslims, as it might occur that there will be this overbearing state if it hasn't already occurred. This can cause some sense of alertness amongst many Muslims, which is probably why many of the personal laws are so sacred to many Muslims, because of this sense that they know that at this moment, with their personal laws, the Indian state will not encroach on their own lives and their own personal lives related to Islam. And this confuses Muslims as a whole with Muslim elites. I think we should make a distinction between what it means when we say Muslim elites are pushing more for the communal policies and not just Muslims as a general category. Because the Muslim elite are the main drivers of the communal and even the separatist state politics for Muslims. This unfortunately makes it seem that Muslims as a whole are the ones that are pushing to break away from India, or that Muslims as a whole want to entirely remove Republic Day as a day that they would celebrate because they do not believe in the Indian state. This is more of the propaganda that the Hindu nationalists make about Muslims. And Muslim people also have their own array of feelings towards the Indian state that I'm not even talking about because I can't understand exactly, but there are many more factors we should take into consideration when discussing them. And some of these actual lower ground block level Muslims might agree with some of these separatist ideas. We can't necessarily deny that, especially if you are living in the ground near Kashmir or any parts near the old Pakistani borderlands, which were very violent at the time. You still have a sense of historical confusion, historical injustice maybe you want served for yourself. This isn't to say those are invalid, but we should look into how these are possibly shifting the dialogue for Indian politics. For many of the elite Muslims, at least, and some of the block level Muslims, it seems that Republic Day is this day celebrating that Indian and especially the Hindus receive this hegemony over the Indian state. So we can understand why this is something that is uncomfortable for some Muslims to feel. Not necessarily have to say that they will protest against Republic Day, but it's an uncomfortable thing to discuss. There are similar sentiments in the US that I could see related to. There's especially this sentiment of I hate America from a lot of minorities and non-white, non-straight, and basically non-Protestant Christian people who feel that because the United States was built off of Anglo-Saxon Christian Protestant ideals, how is it that these ideals are necessarily gone to this day? Sure, we see some progress. We've had a first Black president only about 15-ish years ago. We've had some Catholic presidents in our US history, but it's still this predominant secular, or we should say more Protestant and more white serving country that we've seen more historically than we have seen for other groups. So we can understand how this sentiment means that many people will not feel that their country, in this case of the US, but also for Muslims, they don't feel that the state of India is necessarily serving them because historically the state was built more on Hindu nationalist ideas. Maybe not necessarily trying to get a Hindu state, but the ideas of Hindus were the ones that prevailed and eventually got this state for this group. And this also proposes a question about religion, caste, and history. It's similar to what we talk about in the US. And in the US, we can say that the US is built on this civic nationalism, that you don't have to necessarily be of one color, of one race, or of one ideal. You can be of whatever group. The Indian state, I think, also strives to be this way. That's what the secular model is trying to aim, to include the people and show that the state does not necessarily serve God, but it serves the people. So the question then becomes, what does it mean to be Indian? We want to see that the Indian state, as the Constitution says, is not based off of religion. But when we do see some nationalist ideas about Hindu nationalism, it does cause concern. It does make sense why some do not feel the Indian state is serving all of the people that they claim to serve because of the secular model. Instead, we wonder, is the Indian state, or any state in general, is its values and beliefs, is it on unity, diversity, or secularism, or anything else like that? Those don't all necessarily have to even be going hand in hand. And the idea of unity and diversity, which is also mentioned in this chapter, can also come into contrast because so many diverse opinions doesn't necessarily mean we are in a unified state. A secular model might not be what unifies all Indians, especially people at the block level. If this Nandi approach about how people at the block level of the Indian state are not necessarily striving to have a secular government when they value their religious and especially Hindu-centric ideas. Hindu nationalism is also not fighting for all Hindus, that we should keep in mind. Just like Muslim elites are not fighting for all Muslims. These are only segments of people. This is only just a radical group of people that we should keep in mind are not the whole group of Indians. There might be some sentiments amongst regular Indians of I do believe that some of the Hindu nationalists or maybe some of the Muslim separatist ideas are correct, But this doesn't mean that all these people are necessarily pushing for a Hindu nationalist or Muslim separatist idea. We should keep in mind that these are just segment ideas, sometimes even just far out ideas that have almost no actual backing in something like Congress. There's also a great lesson here to learn that we should also watch out when you go against your own state for moral or ethical principles. This isn't to say that you should never go against your state because it is your state, but we should keep in mind these principles when we see something like the Hindus eventually turning nationalist because of this feeling of unappreciation from the Muslims, whom they welcomed and gave respect to their religion by not instituting a Hindu nationalist model and instead tried to institute a secular model. Keep in mind, when our statements say something like, we want our own state because we want a state that respects our religion, and the state that literally was built off of a secular model, it makes others feel a bit unappreciated and even at times threatened. This is also similar to another American idea of the Great Replacement Theory, where many Americans feel that they are being replaced by immigrants and people who were not necessarily born in the United States, and feel that their ideas, the non-original American ideas, are becoming more of the mainstream ideas and kicking out the original American-born people. It is based off of this sense of negligence by their own home from those that they welcomed and even the government that they believed was going to serve all of them equally. So we should keep this in mind, not to say that we should always respect the nationalist and even the conservative ideas. That is definitely not what I'm saying. But we should keep in mind when we do even say these things, perhaps our wording might make people feel offended or hurt or just essentially neglected, which is something that we sometimes ignore in politics. But it's the fact that we sometimes neglect other voices and sound like we are arrogant and know the answer, and that anyone else's ideas might just be wrong entirely. Now, this isn't necessarily to appease the nationalists, as I said, but keep in mind, what does the nation stand for? Especially with the American model, I can talk about again. You can say that the American model is based off of trying to serve the white Anglo-Saxon Christian model, but remember what the US was also built on, about welcoming immigrants, about welcoming other ideas, about tolerating and having so much freedom for its people, especially from the time when there was not as much freedom in the world, and we still try to institute the same sense of freedom in other ways. So keep in mind when we are saying that the state does not serve me, the Indian state or the United States does not serve me, keep in mind, what do you mean by the state? Because the state does want to welcome immigrants. It wants to welcome others. That's still in the ideas of America. That's still in the ideas of India. We should just keep in mind, what does it mean when we say something like the Indian state is not necessarily serving our Muslim interests? Well, the Indian state is serving a secular interest, which is, as we have said, not necessarily a strict state and religion distinction, but a state respect for all religions equally, so that none is prevailed, including Hinduism, which is the dominant religion of the area. By positioning yourself as a different group from others, and you need this extra support, you enforce this idea that you are also the outsider, something that I think we should also look into. Because Hindu nationalism takes advantage of this idea that Muslims wanted this reservations, communal policies, even a separate state. By literally making yourself seem like an outsider in this land of India, it only gives more fuel to Hindu nationalism because they just build off what you just said about yourself. There's nothing more easier to capitalize on in politics, especially, than the very words you have already said. By saying that we as Muslims need our own state because we are different, we have our own different way of life, all that gives your enemy is saying, exactly, they say that they are different. They have their own way of life. Therefore, they should not be here with us, which is ironically also what the elite Muslims were saying. I'm not sure if they still are saying today, but this was what they were saying. So all it did was add fuel to the fire, something that I don't think many block level Muslims would want to see if it risked kicking them out or even seeing a second type of partition violence erupt. Nandi's claim, I feel, is such an interesting concept. I'm not sure if it's grossly mislabeling Indians as a violent people because of cultural reasons. If so, that doesn't sound the most accurate. But it's interesting that I will talk about these points of how the culture of the West could have welcomed secularism because of the modernity and the progressive initiatives that they underwent. and that everything that happened from the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, that might have been what had helped with secularism. Religious wars and the mass migrations to the Americas, especially, is also an example of the intolerance a society can have and eventually see a secular development. So, from this aspect, I can see that Nandi is talking about how there could have been this time, and maybe Gandhi especially, and from the Indian independence movement, that this was a type of enlightenment and all that. And just like how we had our enlightenment in the West, there was still some violent issues and mass migrations that we saw in later times. Eventually, all this led to a secular model. So from this perception, maybe it's not that the West is only the place that this can come from, but maybe just the whole experience of having so many religious diversity included in one area eventually just makes way for a secular model. So perhaps India can adopt this idea, not because it is a Western idea, but because modernity and development, as we have seen with the Indian modernization movement with the British and with the nationalist movement with Gandhi, especially in his ideals that have become so predominant and eventually guided the politics of India to this day even, shows that maybe this Western concept of secularism can exist entirely outside of the West, and that secularism is truly its own concept. And that maybe this idea of Indian secularism, this pluricultural tolerance for all religions, might actually work given some time, though. I can understand what it means if you want the block level to understand these ideals, because the block level doesn't necessarily follow up with everything that the Indian national government is doing. They're only really following what they've known for generations at a more closer local level. And it takes time for these ideals to eventually come to the village and the very small neighborhoods about even rural parts of India to really ingrain these ideas of a secular and tolerance model for other religions. But unfortunately, secularism just has a tainted Western history. When you talk about secularism, you are going to think about Western ideas usually, because this term did come from there, but it's eventually becoming more of its own concept without the West's attachment. So secularism might work in India as a multicultural, even a religious ignoring form, but the fact that it came from the West truly does make it a difficult conversation and might be discounted often when discussing it for Indian politics. India purposely chose to be anti-Pakistan in a way that it did not choose to go back from Pakistan's model of going firmly pro and being a Islam-based state, but and did not choose to be a Hindu-based state as India. Instead, it chose this secular model for the sake of including all Indians, regardless of religion. India, I think we should also remember the term Indian is not necessarily religious tied. It's similar to the American tide. America is not one religion, and India is not one religion. So we should keep this in mind, I think, because we don't want to confuse that because Pakistan left India for the sake of being a Muslim state does not mean that India is not a Muslim state. It's just a secular state where it tolerates so many other religions. The ideas of Gandhi didn't say that Hinduism was superior, something we should also note, because he saw that there was a need to show respect between the individuals and the state. I think that's a very appropriate model that we also should remember, because the individual is not the most perfect. Religion also sometimes expects perfection at times, and yes, it understands the human flaw, but it does seem like Gandhi's model of how Hinduism wasn't necessarily the superior religion, but that religion as a whole should be ingrained with politics is something that many people, even at those rural and block levels, can relate to because religion is so personal to people's lives that politics, an already personal thing that we cannot deny, perhaps should have some model of religion ingrained because those are two things that we have a part of our lives. Religion, though, is just such a diverse range, whereas the state, everyone has to follow the state. If you're in India, everyone follows the Indian state, but it does not mean that everyone follows one religion. That's where it becomes that there probably should be a model of religion intertwined with politics. This is a very difficult model for me to describe right now, but that is a very worthwhile conversation to discuss and analyze more thoroughly. On the other hand, though, we should keep in mind that India's society history is Hindu-centric. We cannot deny the fact that it wasn't that long ago that Hinduism was the dominant religion that guided Indian traditional life. These things don't necessarily go away overnight, and they definitely didn't go away from the British colonial times. If anything, they've probably just been more pronounced to this day. So we should keep in mind that before we say just embrace religion, we should also remember that Hinduism is likely going to become the dominant one, and we do not want anything like Hindu nationalists that will deny the rights of Muslims, Sikhs, and other religions, their own personal ideas, laws, and their own ways of living that do not become interfered by the state, which then becomes a part of a Hindu-centric state. We should watch out for these two and not becoming one and the same. Establishing secularism might also erase Indian identity as the land it was before colonialism. That is also something that we should also keep in mind, going back to what I just said against it. Because for some, and this is quite a common conception that many have in India, especially from the who remember the days of the traditional society or have roots from this traditional society, you might feel that by making this secular model or not necessarily establishing Hinduism as the national model for the Indian state, it feels that that is almost erasing the Indian identity from the past. Something that we should also keep in mind as it relates back to that idea of being replaced and unappreciated in your own state. This is something that we should also keep in mind because many feel that this is their identity. As being Indian, it means to be Hindu. So we should also not dismiss that idea because that is a valid idea that many have, especially in the heartland of the Hindu lands, because that is what they've known their whole lives and their families have known to be considered India. And given partitions divide on religious grounds, religion still remains a strong idea that moves people literally as it did with partition. So we should keep in mind that religion is a very sensitive topic here in India, especially in those parts bordering Pakistan, because these are still concepts and ideas that are so meaningful that they literally move people and cause violence, but they've also caused so much help for these people at a personal level. We need to recognize that because these two are so sensitive, maybe there should be some type of model where these two are connected because they are so personal for the lives at the block level, especially, and even at the rural level. We can try, but we hope that Hindu nationalism will not prevail. But given its majority as the majority religion of India, we can just hope that this nationalism approach does not try to take all the support from every Hindu and make Hindus believe that that is also the way that we should go about the state. Maybe what I've said about trying to ingrain the state with religion might just mean Hindutva would win in the end, but we should keep in mind also that the majority powers, especially what it means in a democracy to give minorities rights, especially from a majority, the majority powers should not overpower the ideas and the beliefs and the protections that many, especially Muslims, want from the overbearing state, as we've talked about before. Hindutva seems to be attracting Indians as a national unity platform now, and not so much the religious platform that it was based off of and still has some basis from. So because it is blatantly positioning itself as the only competent solution to the ineffective secularism that has been discussed before, this ends up becoming that many end up supporting more of the Hindutva ideas, more for the idea of a national unity, but maybe don't necessarily see the undertones of national Hinduisms, or the Hindu nationalists, I should say. It's widely been agreed for many Indians who have been seeing this whole secular debate amongst those in the top, especially in the Congress Party, that they have just been debating something for so long, secularism, and have not been solving anything. They've just been talking about these solutions, but have not been enacting or making a functioning government on these secular ideas. Hindutva's populism, positioning the elites, which in this case was most of the Congress Party and those who were at the top, makes them seem out of touch to the neglect that the masses feel, which is a classic recipe of populism and how they have won the 2014 elections and continue to dominate. The elites who debate the correct forms of secularism just come across as anti-religious in this case. And to some Hindus who are still the majority of the state, they find this unnerving. And as a movement that acknowledges both the Indian Hindu origins and a goal of unity and not division between the state and religion, which is what the Hindutva model has, this ends up becoming more comforting and more of a viable solution. Because instead of seeing this whole issue of people talking about rhetoric of how they are trying to diminish the power of Hindu power, not necessarily because they want to see Hindus not in power, but because they want to see equal power for all, This just causes this unnerving feeling that these people just keep talking in the top and don't necessarily acknowledge what the actual people who are there living in India are feeling, and how they are not feeling the most unified, especially when they see something like many Muslim elite ideas come up that say we want our own separate state. And even when the Hindu nationalists say that they want to make their own Hindu-based Indian state. What's interesting, though, is that Hindutva just swoops in as almost a rebranding, trying to distance itself from its own things that it said before and just make it seem like they're only unifying on the national basis and that they're only here for the national priority. And although they still have the tones of religious unity and religious nationalism, this idea of being under a national unity for Hindutva as an Indian cultural state just becomes more appealing to those who have been so distraught by the worthless efforts, it seems, of the secular debates for so long that have not really seen much effective solutions. This seems like a warning that we should have. Two warnings, maybe. To be cautious of the internal debates that we have, especially when we are in a power party, that we keep becoming more ingrained with our own rhetoric, that we just become out of touch with the masses, what the people at the ground are discussing, and these figures that we eventually are supposed to take care of. When they feel so distant from the people in power, this only makes populism much easier because it just opens this gap for many feelings of resentment, discomfort, and neglect. And who comes in better than the own people at the top are the ones at the bottom who act like they're at the bottom even sometimes and pretend that they know what you want. And yeah, maybe they know what you want, but they are great at making it sound like they care about you. So watch out for populism, which is my second warning. Be wary of the movements that claim to solve the current problems with a supposedly simple message. You've probably heard the phrase, if something seems so easy or too easy, it's probably not real or something like that. I forgot the phrase exactly, but if you think that something seems way too simple just by simply making a Hindutva state or pushing for this party to unite the country, be wary. Not to say that do not always go against them, but be cautious of just how easy can this simple solution be to unite the people. Because secularism has been a difficult concept that people have been debating for so long. It's hard to believe that this one group can just solve it outright. This thing of politics is there is no simple solution, which is also what we should keep in mind when we fall for populist ideas of simply do this and we will get this. Politics is literally based off of difficulty. You do not get anywhere really the most effective way, at least, by just getting one simple solution of a populist person in power, because everyone has been debating this for so long. Even democracy has still been such a difficult topic that we still have some issues discussing to this day, and that has been rooted back to the ancient Greeks. So these said one-size-fits-all solutions should be cautioned against. I hope you enjoyed my video. I tried my best to still be as unbiased as possible and really just to provide questions, analysis, and to speak out loud wondering what it means for these concepts of secularism in this model, at least, what it means for a secular state to succeed and what it means for a state to be truly secular when we have so much diversity in a state like India.